What do you got against him anyway? I known him since he was a little kid, and he saved my ass with them greases.
Yeah, but we're not fighting a bunch of drunk dirtbags this time. We're about to take out the most powerful family in this city, and you're bringing a kid.
Meet the lovable Vito Scaletta and his best mate Joe Barbaro. The initial impression you get of these two is that Vito is a somewhat level-headed criminal with family values, and Joe is a booze-loving, bombastic womanizer. It's a classic buddy cop matchup, right? After spending some time with them, it's clear that they're both just idiotic degenerates. Here's how your average Mafia 2 mission goes. And you play as Vito, by the way. Vito and Joe get a briefing from some old bloke who's obviously exploiting their naivety. Vito says something like, "That's a bad idea." Joe says, "Don't worry, I got a plan." And then Vito says, "That's a bad plan, but I'll go with it because I'm incapable of rational thought." Then the plan does turn out to be a bad plan, and then Vito questions why he ever went through with it in the first place. Rinse and repeat.
Okay, Joe, whatever. But I'm telling you right now, this is a bad idea.
20 minutes later.
I don't know why I fucking listen to you. I swear, you're like a half a retard sometimes.
Okay, so maybe now you might be thinking that these two are maybe cleverly written as psychopaths and Mafia 2 is actually some sort of commentary on the self-destructive nature of greed and organized crime, and sure, I think that's actually what the writers intended. Flashes of progress and success are overshadowed by countless setbacks and failures, and if Mafia 2 was actually well written, there's nothing really wrong with telling a story of defeat. But it's not well written. It's absurd. So Vito does a lot of stupid things for no rational reason. And by a lot, I mean virtually every decision he makes is questionable. At the start of the game, Vito gets sent off to the war because he and Joe were caught robbing a jewelry store. Of course, when he gets back 2 years later, pretty much the first thing he does is commit some good old crime with your boy Joe Barbaro. Funnily enough, this gets Vito sent to prison less than a month later, where he spends the next 6 years of his life. Once he finally gets out, his cunning judgment treats us to this scene.
I got a piece for you, too, if you want it. Here. Always comes in handy. So, what do you want to do now that you're a free man?
Hey, what do you think? I want to go back to working with you again.
All right.
I swear, you're like a half a retard sometimes.
Why is Vito so eager after spending literally less than 1 month of the last 8 years free from prison or war? And Joe was pretty much the reason he was in those situations. It's insane. Vito's always willing to do the most violent and unethical things without any consideration. So you spend the game wondering why Vito is doing any of this, and apparently Vito is wondering the same thing. Every now and then he rhetorically asks himself why, and then continues to be a psychopath. A couple of times, however, he actually answers that leading question. One time he says, "It pays better than taxi driving." I guess this is a throwback to the first game. The other time, he says that he does what he does just to buy things like a house and a car. I love this line because it's just so relatable. I would also kill hundreds and hundreds of people for a nice house. Compare this to Mafia 1's protagonist Tommy Angelo, a man who was initially reluctant to join the mob because he preferred working as a taxi driver like a normal person, and then he joined out of desperation from losing the job and needing money in the Great Depression. Later on in the story, he even rats out the mob because of his moral stance. Angelo is a human being, and because of this, Mafia's story is emotionally impactful. Mafia 2's story lacks any impact at all. Everything comes and goes before it can resonate, and characters are introduced and disappear before they can leave any discernible impression. If you've played this game, I challenge you to name 3 characters off the top of your head that aren't Vito or Joe. Let's see here, major characters. Who can forget Steve Coyne? Or how about the classic antics of Pepe Costa? Oh, and how did I forget the aptly named Joe's Girl? The most memorable part of this game is probably the prison sequence, and the idea behind this mission is full of potential. The 6-year sentence is boiled down to about half an hour in-game, where the restrictive and small prison yard contrasts against the open city. This could have served as an interesting rehabilitation sequence, or even a Driver Parallel Lines-esque revenge motivator, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Instead, it's just a series of meaningless hand-to-hand challenges. More on those later. The excuse for these fights is that you're in a fight club, and it even does that cliched thing where you get jumped in the shower. Oh, and how could I forget, we also find out that Vito is a racist while we're in jail.
Watch where you walk, Guaylo.
Maybe if your eyes were all the way open, you would have seen me coming, asshole.
Why are we playing as this guy again? Credit where credit is due, the whole sequence feels very brutal and grimy, especially with the prison guards constantly kicking you when you're down, but It all amounts to nothing because none of it impacted Vito in the long run. You could take the prison part out of Mafia 2 and the story would lose almost nothing. I say almost because you meet this guy named Leo Galante who runs the Fight Club, and yes, I did have to look his name up. Leo treats Vito well by getting him a nicer room in prison and shortening his sentence, so this is the least toxic relationship Vito ever establishes outside of his family. Towards the end of the game, Vito finds out that a fellow member of his gang is being sent to kill Leo, so Vito rushes to Leo's house to warn him. Once Vito gets there, he just tries to convince both parties that Leo shouldn't need to die, but once they tell him otherwise, he just concedes. This should have been a great time for Vito to really stick up for his morals and stick up for the only character that was good to him. And yeah, while he does actually try for once, it's way too little and way too late. Vito showed us a glimpse of some sort of human side here, but then went back to being his usual soulless robot self. The other times Vito shows us a little humanity is when he interacts with his family. After getting back from the war, the fam owes some money to some bad people and Vito takes it on himself to get that money. Hooray for some normal motivation. After just casually killing a bunch of people with Joe, Vito heads down to the docks to do a regular labour job and make some money. This is a gameplay segment where you load up a truck with crates. Parallels can be drawn to the taxi mission from the original game. The game gives you the choice to leave, but of course you don't actually have a choice because this is a video game. This labour job very obviously isn't going to get you enough money for the family, so Vito finds a higher paying, higher risk job. And this all works and makes sense. Vito needs to do some mobster shit to save his family. If this was the plot for the entire game, it probably would have been a much more cohesive story than what we got. But of course, just 2 chapters later, Vito pays back the debt and his motivation as a character from then on disappears entirely. We haven't even scratched the surface of Vito's bad decisions yet. At one point, he gets in a car with and befriends a guy that sort of put him in prison earlier, and then surprise surprise, the guy turns out to be an undercover cop. Another time, the game montages Vito and co dealing heroin throughout the city. I'm sure that idea will turn out great. I could go on and on about how this game is just full of idiots, with Vito perhaps being the stupidest of them all, but I'll try not to get any more carried away on this point. I think this game wants you to feel frustrated and defeated by Vito's lack of success, but Mafia 2 isn't frustrating because I want Vito to succeed, it's frustrating because I want him to quit. Mafia 2's story and characters, while being very well acted, leave no discernible impression and are ultimately confused and forgettable. It's a far cry from the original game. Speaking of the original game, smooth segue, Mafia 2 takes a lot of cues from Mafia 1 like it should, so it's important to understand the original game's strengths and weaknesses. I recently made a video about it, but to sum it up, it's a game which does everything it can to draw you into its illusion. It has a well-written story, a convincing game world, and mechanics which are designed to be realistic above anything else. It has its problems, the racing level, but it nails its 2 main goals of telling a strong mob story and being immersive. I recommend that you watch my video on the original game before continuing on with this one, but you should be okay either way. A link for it is in the description. In that video, I focused on the world and mechanics of Mafia, and it's interesting to see how Mafia 2 handles the same thing. The same goals of immersion are sought after here, but being released in 2010 rather than 2002, it was influenced by a whole new generation of games. This is most obvious with the gunplay. Cover shooters were huge in 2010. Games like Gears of War and Uncharted paved the way for Mafia 2's combat, complete with a sprint button, a cover system, and regenerating health. Weapons are fairly similar to the first game, though there's a lot more variance than before. Grenades and Molotovs are back, though again they are unfortunately very uncommon. It all controls like you would expect, but weirdly you can't blind fire from cover. Unsurprisingly, Mafia 2 suffers from all the same problems as your average cover shooter, with the biggest one being the regenerating health thing. Enemies aren't very good at flushing you out of cover, so you spend half the game sitting in cover and battling your own patience more than anything else. I almost forgot that there's actually a food system in this game. Health only regenerates to a point, and to fill up to full health you need to eat or drink. The point it regenerates to is high enough that you never actually need to do this though, so it just feels like a completely half-baked mechanic. Scattered around the game are era-specific Playboy magazines as collectibles, and hey, I mean it's hard to complain about these, but stopping in the middle of a firefight to search for porn feels about as stupid as it sounds. And they're always in the strangest of places. Why is there a perfectly clean magazine in this grimy sewer? And speaking of this sewer, why aren't my weapons allowed in here? Where Mafia 2's combat shines is with its set pieces and general game feel. Scoring headshots feels fantastic, and the animation and particle effects are top notch. Getting caught in shootouts on skyscrapers or restaurants is really something to behold in this game. So as far as how the gunplay feels, it's good enough, or rather it's a cover shooter. Does it contribute to the whole immersion thing? Well, it's not nearly at the level of the first game, it's much more forgiving and fast-paced, making it seem more like a Hollywood blockbuster than a sim shooter. And the Playboy magazines certainly don't help and break the illusion. But to be fair, the first game's combat didn't completely pull off the whole immersion thing either. Both games suffer from that problem of trying to tell a story which is grounded and realistic, but also starring a one-man army killing machine who mows down hundreds and hundreds of people. The difference is that where this is the biggest problem in the original game, this is just the start of Mafia 2's problems. Stealth sections play a larger role in Mafia 2. As you'd expect, you just gotta sneak up behind people and do one-button takedowns. There's only really a few occasions where stealth is an option, but it's fun enough while it lasts. Breaking up the gunplay is an all-new fistfighting mode. Taking stage in the absence of melee weapons, this can best be described as a bad minigame. Its faux depth is more transparent than Mafia 3's copy and paste mission design. They're more or less just about spamming attack or countering quickly, which sounds fair enough, but it controls so clumsily and unresponsively that it's just a chore. Outside of some cheap deaths, they're not particularly challenging, and there's just way too many of them. The only positive I have to say is that they're at least sort of realistic. They don't really detract from that aspect of Mafia 2. Otherwise, the fistfights are just bad. Like the first game, driving takes up the bulk of the gameplay. The driving initially feels a little boring until you discover there's a simulation mode, which, when toggled on, feels genuinely great, even better than the first game. Cars have weight to them, cornering takes skill, and driving at high speeds is risky and exciting. They genuinely feel like overpowered chunks of American steel, and it's some of the best driving mechanics in an open-world action game to date. But as always with this game, there's a catch. Mafia 2 has no idea how to properly use these mechanics to suit its storytelling, which is something that the first game did. Again, let's go back to the original game and compare. It had an unforgiving police system which would punish you for breaking simple traffic laws like speeding or running a red light. This culminated in a general feeling of mundane realism, which gave the city an extra layer of life, and as frustrating as it was at times, it felt really immersive. You drove around like a relatively normal driver in that city because that was the best way to get around. Mafia 2 puts in a half-hearted effort to achieve the same thing. The speed limiter is back, but it's capped lower than the police actually let you go. The street sign says the limit is 40, but the cops never seemed to give a shit when I was drifting around between 60 and 70 miles an hour. It really feels like you have to be flooring it at lethally fast speeds to get any cop to care, and even then it's a 50-50 call whether they'll bother. There were multiple times when I bumped into other cars near cops and they just didn't care. Or hell, I even bumped into cops and they didn't care. At one point, I hijacked a car by pulling out the driver in front of a cop car and an on-foot cop, and it seems like they care less about what Vito's doing than I do. Just after that incident, I stole another cop car and this happened. I just don't have anything to say to that. Police flat out don't care if you run red lights, but the passengers in your car do. Every time you run a red, Joe will complain about how you should stop at traffic lights. This is interesting to me because it feels like at some point in development they coded in the recognition of running a red, but after some testers whinged about it being too hard, they took it out. All of the framework for the same system as the first game is here, but they chickened out from actually utilizing it. Instead of driving with care to get around, the best way of traveling in Mafia 2 is to drive like you're collecting stars in GTA. The entire immersion aspect is absent. On top of that, driving missions are down to a minimum. It has a rare tailing mission or escape mission every now and again, but whenever it starts a chase mission, it's scripted so that the car you're chasing always escapes. Remember that the driving in this game is actually really fun, but apparently not taking advantage of the mechanics in Mafia 2 is just par for the course. Ironically, the racing mission from the first game would have been a welcome addition here. The mission design is just generally all over the place. Long bland stretches punctuate every fun set-piece shootout. One mission has you driving to as many petrol stations as possible within a time limit. How inventive. Another has you selling cigars out the back of a truck near the end of the game. Also near the end of the game, you're required to amass money to progress, which is by far the dullest segment of the game. There are only a few ways to get money, each of which are more boring than the last. I ended up stealing cars and crushing them half a dozen times, and the only reason I didn't quit the game then and there was because I wanted to make this review. I get that quiet moments are really important for pacing, but the balance feels all out of whack here. In the first game, the quiet moments were the driving. Generally, you drove to your mission, did the mission, then drove back to the bar. It was sort of a calm before the storm and a time to calm back down afterwards. In Mafia 2, you'll drive across the map just to visit Joe and then go on another lengthy drive home to answer the phone and go to bed. It's just a chore. This all feeds into just how poor the pacing is. Like I said earlier, characters really do just come and go, and they all just feel completely disposable. The story beats seem like they should be payoffs to setups, but they're lacking in any setups. The perfect example of this is when Vito and Joe become made men. Almost completely out of the blue they get promoted, and then the game resonates on how much of a big deal this is. I don't know why it's a big deal, I didn't even know Vito and Joe wanted this, and I definitely don't care about all of these other mobsters, but hey, the game just moves on to the next completely unrelated plot point as soon as it has the chance. The biggest other time it does this payoff with no setup thing is at the very end, and I won't go into detail, but if you finished Mafia 2 then you probably know what I mean. Or maybe you've forgotten the ending because it's just as forgettable as Mafia 2 as a whole. And that pretty much sums up Mafia 2. It is forgettable. This hasn't been a comprehensive review. Parts of the game I haven't mentioned, like the music and atmosphere, are great, and as you can see, the visuals are still stunning, but none of the good parts of Mafia 2 amount to anything because the game is constantly letting itself down. I also could have gone through the game scene by scene and picked apart so many annoying little things. At one point, you and your company get frisked in a cutscene, no weapons are found, and then shortly afterwards, you all draw pistols out of your jackets. It's just stupid. Something I find so interesting about this game is how it genuinely tried to be a successor to what was Mafia: The City of Lost Heaven. If you remember Mafia 2's critical and public reception, the leading complaint was how it was too linear and didn't use its open world, but I've always disagreed with this. The original game showed how to do linearity in an open world game. It showed that it can be done, and honestly, I very much prefer this to copy and paste trash tier Ubisoft missions, but Mafia 2, being so poorly paced, failed to realize why this linearity worked so well. Mafia 2 is a technically polished game with decent mechanics, but every game should be. Its countless problems poison every aspect of the game, resulting in an entirely mediocre experience. Mafia 2 is a disappointing and forgettable video game, and an even worse sequel. But hey, at least it's not Mafia 3.